We're going to put up on the board for you on the screen the question about favoring expansion into the United States. Would it benefit the Canadian Football League? Can this league survive without expanding into the United States? Is it dead in a year or two if it doesn't?
If you earn, $100 a week, but you spent $200 a week, you're going to be bankrupt.
There's 4 new owners because there was 4 bankrupt teams.
The American team is here to stay.
But I don't want to take the C out of the Canadian Football League, and that's hogwash.
The era of CFL expansion into the United States didn't last very long.
American expansion's been a disaster with the exception of Baltimore. Now that means either conceptually it was a bad idea or you didn't carry it off properly. Which was the case?
Some of it was very good.
But this has been a very satisfying season for the Baltimore Stallions, and they celebrate as Grey Cup champions of 1995.
Some of it very, very bad. But was it necessary? And is the CFL still around today because of it?
We have to be different. We have to try and expand and export an outstanding, unique Canadian game.
Those are some of the questions we're going to try to answer by talking to people who not only covered the league, but the people on the inside. So let's take a deep dive into that period of CFL expansion into the United States. The early 90s in the CFL was just a crazy time. Financially, the league was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. Teams were surviving on a game-by-game basis, and players weren't even sure if their checks were going to cash. And it didn't help that they saw a reduction in their TV money coming in. In short, they were broke.
You know that when you hear like a shark, it has to keep swimming or it dies, right? The CFL was kind of like the shark. It had to keep swimming.
And it looked like the CFL was kind of being left behind. The situation was that dire.
I think the mood of the time was the CFL was, dying.
The Ottawa Rough Riders went bankrupt about 4 weeks after the start of the 1991 season. The now mighty Saskatchewan Rough Riders were not mighty back in the early 90s. They were not that far removed from having to hold telethons to raise enough money to pay their bills.
No team could ever afford to lose, but 4 had to every week. The theme was, oh boy, if they lose this game, the fans aren't coming for the next game, and this franchise is going to be done.
How do you grow new revenues for the Canadian Football League? And that is the challenge today. And that was the challenge 30 years ago.
The league needed something. They got the McNall group. The McNall-Gretzky Candy group came in 91, which was a big burst of positive publicity for the league.
Was it ever? For many around the league, the new ownership group was that light at the end of the tunnel they were looking for. You have 2 of the most famous Canadians alongside a businessman best known for pulling off one of the biggest trades in sports history when he brought Wayne Gretzky to the LA Kings. He was also known for going to jail for defrauding banks out of $236 million, but that's a story for another day. At that time, Bruce McNall knew a thing or two about how to make a product cool and, more importantly, profitable again. And now he was looking to do that with an entire league. A league he invested in, by the way, because his buddies told him to.
When we first bought the team, I didn't have any clue to anything. And I said, well, what are the arguments? It's a football team in Canada. I said, oh, really? And so then I asked Gretzky. I said, do you ever hear the arguments? Oh, yeah, I was a big fan. Toronto was a big deal to us, and I was a fan of them. I said, oh, really? I asked John Candy the same thing. Huge fan. So we ended up buying a team.
But it wasn't just the name of the team that McNall didn't know.
And I really hadn't done a whole lot of research and background on the league itself until we got into it. And then realized that, there's some issues around the league. And so the idea was to try to shore up the ownership so that they had people that were more viable, as well as getting a television deal that made more sense. And the next step was maybe we could expand to the United States.
And they needed those expansion checks. That at the time, expansion seemed like it was their best, if not their only option.
And the idea was, let's see if we can bring in some new markets, some new interest, get some American TV money, and that was the real pot of gold that never surfaced.
There's a market of 300 million people who love football, and there's a time of year where they don't have football, and there's markets where people are willing to write checks right now for teams. That's how we got on the road to U.S. expansion.
Enter Larry Smith. Now, on the surface, He was a football guy. Drafted first overall in 1972, he played 9 seasons in the league, winning 2 Grey Cups. But make no mistake, he was not hired to be a commissioner in the traditional sense.
I think Larry Smith was hired, to execute this. It was not Larry Smith's idea.
A man with an impossible mission: expand us into the U.S., grow our revenue, fix our problems.
He was hired to grow the league in any way possible. And expansion was certainly one, maybe the most important.
And he had so many problems. It was like a guy trying to put a finger into the dike, and then he's trying to put another finger into another hole somewhere else.
I can go yin and yang on Larry Smith, okay? Because, again, he was hired to do a job. And it was a hard job. And it was a job at the point of a gun. Like, we need to do this now. But I think there were times where Larry could not admit that something wasn't working or had gone, or wasn't living up to their expectations. And he tried to paint the pig for the media too many times.
But I would ask some of these people that have come out of the closet and complained about our expansion, what have you done lately? Have you gone to a football game? Have you supported Canadian university football?
He did treat journalists with a fair bit of disdain. Which is never a smart thing to do. You don't insult somebody who buys ink by the barrel, is the old joke.
I think some of the press were over anxious to try to create a story. Maybe they didn't have anything to write about.
But I also have, some degree of empathy for the fact that he had an extraordinarily difficult job to do.
Honestly, I think Larry Smith should go down in history as somebody who really helped keep the league alive at a time when it very well could have gone out of business.
So Bruce McNall pushed for it. Larry Smith was put in charge of it, but you may be surprised at who was one of the most, if not the most, important figures in the CFL expanding into the United States. John Candy. Yeah, Uncle Buck.
He was 90% of it, I would say. I mean, he was it. I mean, yes, there are other people involved. I was involved, Larry Smith, other people. But, he was the leader.
And eventually, with expansion and the things we're going to be doing, we'll make it work.
A colorful but very influential figure in the operation of the CFL because, he had a lot of money in the Argonauts.
He had his soul. Some people had their money in the CFL. Some people had their money and their soul in the CFL. John Candy had his soul in it.
I guaranteed him not to have to put up more money than he did. So that when Wayne and I are covering losses that came about by the time the second year was around, and then later on, John never had to put up another nickel. So he couldn't care less about the economics of it all. He was all a fan.
Yeah, he was the chair of the CFL's expansion committee. He completely embraced the concept. John had interestingly, he'd started off his career in Toronto with Second City and SCTV, and then he'd become a major Hollywood star. So he personally experienced the idea of going from a big fish in a pretty small market to a big fish in a global market.
He would go into a city 3 or 4 days before the Argos played there and do free publicity. Like, imagine what it would cost the CFL to get, movie star of his status to go in and do publicity for a football game.
Why? What's it to you?
He was just doing that.
What else you want?
I mean, he literally stopped his acting career. I mean, he didn't do anything in those years because he was so dedicated to the CFL.
He grabbed onto expansion as an idea that might become the salvation for the league, and who better to sell it than John Candy, one of the most popular, attractive humans on the planet, right?
So the wheels were officially in motion, and while the league looked for cities that would make good locations and owners with deep pockets, Canadian football fans began to worry. What would happen to the Canadian identity of the league? Would the big bad American owners come in and want 4 downs? What about changing the size of the field or the ball? What if the name of the league itself was suddenly in jeopardy?
The brand is CFL.
So it's still Canadian Football League?
CFL.
Continental Football?
CFL. That's the brand. NFL is their brand. Our brand is CFL.
I know a lot of the Canadians aren't like, there's an insecurity with Canadians always, right? There's always the insecurity of the big bad guy in the South. Look, a lot of people didn't like the Gretzky deal too, right? They all thought, well, he should be a Canadian.
To a small extent. I think everybody realized that the Canadian game, the Canadian identity of the game was going to be safe as long as it was a 3-down game.
Yes, there was a lot of fear that the rules would be tampered with, that this unique, different football version that we play up here would become more like American football, which at the time was perceived as, and probably was to some extent, a more boring version of football than Canadian football at that time. But the other thing was the Canadian player.
U.S. law said you can't mandate an American company to have a certain percentage of foreign workers. And I think we all understand the way U.S. labor law works. That would have been an impossibility. So that's actually what shut down, the idea that these teams would be forced to have Canadians. And Larry Smith took a lot of criticism because, of course, he had been a player who benefited from there being a Canadian ratio.
And so you were going to have, one team or 4 teams or 5 teams, whatever the number became, of fully American rosters going up against lineups that were basically half Americans and half Canadians. And there was a belief and a perception at the time that, America is a football factory and these franchises will run roughshod over us.
That was the big issue, I think, with expansion into the U.S. Not so much the game losing its identity, because as long as it stayed 3-down game, it was going to be safe, I think.
So that first season, 1991, ended up having just one team south of the border, the Sacramento Gold Miners, who would later move to San Antonio. But over the next 2 seasons, 5 more teams would join: the Shreveport Pirates, the Las Vegas Posse, the Memphis Mad Dogs, the Birmingham Barracudas, and the Baltimore... Well, that part's a bit tricky. You see, the original plan was to call them the Colts to appease all of those angry NFL fans that lost their team in 1983 to relocation. But the NFL went to the courts to block the team using the name. And just hours before their first game in the CFL, a judge ruled they couldn't be referred to as the Colts.
We acknowledge from the outset that we're under a court injunction to resist all temptation to refer to Baltimore as spirited young horses of any kind, and until the matter is straightened out in the American court system, we'll try to comply, but forgive us if we slip up occasionally.
The Baltimore Colts, then the Baltimore CFL Colts, then the Baltimore CFLers, then the Baltimore Stallions. Yeah, it did not help the league's image to have that kind of stuff going on.
The Baltimore no names.
Obviously, we want the Colts name. I wasn't supposed to say that, was it?
But whatever you called them, all of these years later, there's one thing that is beyond debate. They were the most successful American franchise in CFL history. Back-to-back Grey Cup appearances, 1 championship, and one of the all-time greatest teams.
Grey Cup champions of 1995.
Every U.S. expansion team, except the Baltimore Stallions, hired a former NFL or USFL coach.
Some guys came up here and they just thought, okay, well, it's just the same as American football, except that you pretend you're starting on 2nd down because you've only got 3 down. So it's 2nd and 10 when you get the football. Well, that's just a backwards, stupid way of looking at it.
That was a bad idea. Like it's different game, we know, right? And they weren't even, it wasn't like you just hired a USFL or XFL coach and the rest of your staff was experienced CFL guys. There were some experienced CFL guys on staff sprinkled in, but by and large, these were staffs that had almost no CFL experience, and the exception was Baltimore.
Don Matthews was one of the best coaches that Canadian football had ever seen. He'd been part of the Edmonton dynasty in the late 70s and early 80s. He'd won a Grey Cup as head coach with the BC Lions. He knew Canadian football inside out. The Baltimore team figured out how to stock themselves with tremendously good talent, including all kinds of players who played in the Canadian Football League before. And so that all-American lineup became a dominant force, and they won the Grey Cup, the only one that left the country.
And by the way, they were making money doing it. But over in Las Vegas...
Oh, Canada, our home and native land.
I recall it well. It was one of the highlights of American expansion.
I remember watching it and thinking, oh my God, what is going on? That was so awful.
Don't remember it. I probably purposely lost it in my head.
Yes, I was there. It was 1,000,000 degrees. There's 12,000 people there. And I was working for CBC Radio and had one of those old school tape recorders. And when he started to get 2 bars into it, I was like, where's my tape recorder, right? And I'm scrambling for it, and which I'm not used to doing during the anthem.
Far and wide, O Canada, we stand on guard for thee.
He sung it to the tune of "Oh Christmas Tree," so it came out, I can't do it, but it came out kind of like "Oh Canada, oh Canada."
Far and wide, O Canada.
And they invited him to Hamilton the next week to get it right, by the way.
And they did it up big. They brought him out in a limo, and I remember him getting out of the limo and singing the anthem. And he got through it this time, and I guess you could say it was close to how "O Canada" should be sung. But it still wasn't great.
Our home and native land.
However, I do remember interviewing him after he had done it.
I had forgotten about the Scott Oak thing, or I may never have, maybe didn't watch that game and didn't know it. That's absolutely hilarious. I hope you've got that footage.
I want you to meet the happiest man in the world, Dennis K.C. Park, skewered around North America for his performance in Vegas, so it's only fair that we give him a final word on this. How good do you feel?
I feel good. It's right there. I feel good, and I didn't know if I would, but it turned out that I do.
Trivia question: do you know who sang the U.S. Anthem that night, the Star Spangled Banner? Dionne Warwick. Yeah, it was just a surreal moment on top of a surreal setting, I would describe it.
So yeah, the Stallions were doing well on and off the field, but the other 5 teams were not. And when you add that to the fact that the Cleveland Browns of the NFL were moving to Baltimore, while the CFL's American expansion quickly started to unravel.
Look, it's the old adage, you got to give the people what they want. And did they want it in the U.S.? The answer would be no.
The last game or two of the posse ended up being moved to Edmonton because it was just dead in the Las Vegas market, and that's when you're dead man walking, right? When you can't even play your home games anymore. You've got to go elsewhere.
I remember doing a game in the San Antonio Dome, and my God, it just felt like a cavernous, wide open place with minimal fans. It didn't look good.
So I think that was kind of the saddest thing, where it just felt like nobody cared when you watch those games. Those follow 95 games where you just felt, man, what are we doing here?
Ultimately, I would say the failure was because, for whatever early success the CFL might have had in the U.S., it fell apart when American college football started.
The cities that wanted CFL teams and the ones that got them ended up having to compete with college teams that are right in their backyard. And college, especially in the South, is huge. It's the biggest thing. It's bigger than the NFL.
Birmingham and Memphis, those are college football markets. And when college football started, it was like, Birmingham, you literally went from 35,000 games to 2.
In the United States, Friday night is high school football, Saturday is college football, and Sunday is NFL. That doesn't leave a lot of room for Canadian football once you get to Labor Day and those seasons all start.
But all of that being said, decades later, were there any positives that came out of the CFL's 3-year expansion into the United States?
The Baltimore Stallions franchise was moved to Montreal in '96 and got resurrected.
I mean, at that time, nobody was talking about putting a team in Montreal. I mean, the Canadian Football League kind of didn't exist, even though football in Quebec was starting to thrive.
Here we are, 26 years later, they're still here and still doing well.
And the team won, like their first 10 years, I think they won like a dozen games at least, right? And they arrived with a Hall of Fame quarterback in Tracy Ham and transitioned to another one in Anthony Calvillo. And I mean, they were basically 20 years with 2 quarterbacks, which is, in any football league, is unreal.
In my view, the CFL would have been dead if it hadn't been for expansion, actually, which a lot of people don't, they think it was a huge failure. I think expansion bought the league some time, and it brought them some much needed money.
Oh yeah? There was one more.
I got 2 kids out of it. My ex-wife I met in Memphis at a Birmingham, on my way to a Birmingham Stallions at Memphis Mad Dogs game. So my kids are the byproduct of U.S. expansion, if you can believe that. And every once in a while I remind my daughter that she should be happy that there was U.S. expansion in the CFL, otherwise she would not exist.